It's okay.
Wait for everybody to start. Is this mic
There it
live?
is. Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special mission conference celebrating 150 years of Adventist mission.
It is a true privilege to gather here at Andrews University, both in person and virtually, with participants joining us from all over the world.
Your presence, whether here or online, is a testament to the enduring global commitment to our shared mission.
This conference offers us a unique opportunity to reflect on the rich history of Adventist mission, to explore its challenges and triumphs, and to envision its future.
We are especially grateful to the dedicated missionaries, scholars, and church leaders who continue to shape and carry forward our mission work in diverse cultural contexts under the guidance of the Holy Spirit.
It is your stories, insights, and experiences that will inspire and inform the discussions over the next few days.
We have a couple of announcements that we would like to share with you. If you are here in person and for this weekend you park your car here at the seminary parking lot, Shanshun parking lot, or H-Park over there, you will not get a ticket.
And if you plan to visit the Adventist Heritage Village on Sunday in Battle Creek, please make sure to register and complete the necessary forms by 8 o'clock tonight to secure your spot on the list. For more details, kindly see the registration desk. If you have already registered, please confirm with the registration desk. Also, each of you have received in your program a 3x5 card. This is intended for submitting questions that you would like to hear discussed at the discussions at the end of each paper session. You'll notice the basket up here with the sign that says, please place your discussion questions in basket. That's because we want them in the basket.
To our dear presenters, we will plead that you do your best to stick to the 25 minutes that are given to you. For those introducing this evening, 10 minutes. Thank you once again for being part of this very significant occasion. May God richly bless our time together. Before we have the first presenter, I would like Dr. Reeve to lead us in prayer.
Let's bow our heads. Our loving God, we thank you that you have inspired generations of Adventists to go as missionaries. This weekend, we ask that you would inspire us again. We place ourselves in your hands, requesting your presence. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good evening. It is an absolute privilege for me and joy to welcome all of you to this mission conference. We as a church, we have a beautiful, powerful, awesome message. And this message needs to go to the whole world. So I am very glad that we can be here and speak about the mission. So welcome all of you from the community here. Welcome seminarians, professors. But I would like also especially welcome all the leaders of the church. I know that this week was very busy for General Conference. There was an annual conference, annual meeting there, and it was packed with the focus on mission. I never saw, as I was attending these annual conferences and annual meetings, such a beautiful and high focus on mission. It was so powerful, so powerful. It was so beautiful that even one of the presenters was called that he will be nominated to the Nobel Prize because it was so good. So I am glad that I can welcome here the president of our General Conference, Elder Wilson. Welcome with his wife, Nancy. Also, welcome to the Arthur Keller as General Secretary of the General Conference. I don't know if Elder Paul Douglas is here. No, not this time. But then I saw also many presidents of different divisions, like from Europe and from Australia, from South America, and also from Asia. I was sitting just in the table with those who were coming from Korea. So welcome all of you. We are so proud that you came here, that we can together think about how to advance God's cause, how to do God's mission. It is not our work, it's God's work, so it is good. And it is on the occasion that we are celebrating this 100 years of sending the first, this official missionary to Europe, J.N. Andrews. And it is also the 150 years of the existence of Andrews University. It's an existence of Andrews University. But let me tell you that it started in 1874, and now we are here in 2024. And yes, everything started in Battle Creek. And you have this building there on the screen, I hope. Yes, it is here. But let me also stress that this year, we also in the theological seminary celebrating 90 years of anniversary. So let me say that yes, in 1874 everything started in Battle Creek. Then in 1901, Battle Creek College moved to Berrien Springs, and it was renamed as Emmanuel Missionary College. And during the time when was here Emmanuel Missionary College, it was decided to start advanced Bible school. And so this was like the first theological seminary from 1934. And do you know where it started? In beautiful sunny California. And because the church knew that it will be a big distraction for the students, so they moved us from California at the time to Washington, D.C. And then I don't know why, but then they said maybe they need to go a little bit far from the General Conference, I don't know. And they sent us here to Berrien Springs, where was the Emmanuel Missionary College. And when we arrived here, came, so Andrews University was named as Andrews University. So this was the journey, maybe some pictures here. The first advanced Bible school in Pacific Union College. Then in Washington, D.C., it was the building for the seminary at the time as a Potomac University. And now from the 1960, we are located here in Berrien Springs. And from 2001, we have this new building in which we are here. We are glad that we are in the chapel of the seminary, where we are worshiping regularly every week. But let me quickly show that when seminary started in 1934, it was with a very heavy load. Just imagine, in the first 12-week session, 12 weeks, 3 months, okay? And there were 7 courses taught during the first 6-week period. Then 5 in the second period. And in addition to that, there were 6 lecture courses in the 2-week segments. Very, very high. And then during the time was also taught Greek and Hebrew. And I know that also there were some modern languages because there was plan to go to the mission. So they were studying Chinese and Korean and some other languages. So it was an Arabic, yes, Arabic. It was very heavy load. And nobody complained. Everybody enjoyed. And praise the Lord for this beginning. But let me also tell you what was the tuition in 1934. As for the finances, the bulletin reads, the charges are as follows. Matriculation and library, $5. Tuition per credit, 1 hour, $3. Room rent per week, $2. And meals per week, $4.50. You know, I heard the rumor that General Conference in the annual council were rethinking all these tuition costs. So maybe next year will be different. It will be nice, right? To have these charges as it goes. So we are glad that we had different leaders here. You can see it started in 1934 with Milton Kern. It goes to Dr. Ribok and Hendershot and Dick, and then we had additional 3, Charles Benninger, till 1960, when the seminary was part of the Andrews University. William Murdoch started, then was Sigrid Horn, then Thomas Blinko, Gerhard Hasel, Roald Dederen, Werner Viehmeister, and lastly, John McVeigh, Dennis Fortin, and I have the privilege to be the dean this time. So, mission of the Theological Seminary, Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, is very clear: to serve God and to serve Seventh-day Adventist Church. We are existing only because our church exists, and we are happy to be that theological resource for our beloved church. And we are preparing effective leaders, not managers, but leaders in the church, to be pastors, administrators, teachers of the Bible, in order to proclaim, and this is the mission, to proclaim this everlasting gospel and make disciples of all peoples in anticipation of Christ's second return. So may God bless you in this beautiful time now till Sunday morning, that you can be in this unique place. This is the best place in the world, because here are prepared the leaders for this church in order to proclaim everlasting gospel. This mission is our priority. God bless you, and welcome once again.
Good evening, everyone. At the General Conference, the Worldwide Mission is in charge of, or Secretariat is in charge of the Worldwide Mission. And for this reason, I'm coming here today to welcome each of you to this mission conference on behalf of General Conference Secretariat and all our organizations. We have a very creative name for our organizations that all together are in charge of the Adventist mission. We call ourselves Mission Family. And we have organizations like Adventist Mission, IWM, Institute of World Mission, IPRS, that's a very strange name for many of you. IPRS is International Personal Resources and Services, is the area of the church that is taking care of all our missionaries around the world. We have AVS, Adventist Volunteer Service, and Vivid Faith, that is our digital platform for mission. All these organizations together under Secretariat are taking care of our worldwide mission. And on behalf of all of them, welcome each of you for this conference or for this symposium. You know, I really believe that a healthy church is a church that moves forward, keeping the eyes on the windshield without taking the eyes off of the rear view mirror. Can you agree with me on that? A healthy church moves forward, looking at the windshield, but without taking the eyes out of the rearview mirror. And that is our reality. As Seventh-day Adventist Church and Seventh-day Adventist Worldwide Mission, we are very focused on the windshield. We are looking forward. And we have two major movements that are integrating all of us in this movement. Number one, we call this movement Mission Refocus. It's not a program, it's not a project or initiative. This is a movement, and a movement that I like to say that has two different wings. The first one is what we call the reorganization of our missionary sending. When we started to evaluate all the missionaries that we have around the world, we identified that 84% of them, and I'm talking about the data that represent our current reality, 84% of them are working internationally, but not in the front line area. They are not planting churches. They are not expanding the presence of the church. They are working in very important and strategic positions around the world, but they are not working in the front line. And our first initiative is to change that reality. Instead of 84% working in non-front line areas, our dream, our target, our goal is in 10 years, our idea is to have 70% of all our international missionaries working in the front-line areas, non-entered areas or people groups, or low-entered areas and people groups as well. This is one of the wings. And the second wing is an invitation for all divisions and unions and organizations and institutions to sponsor missionaries. We are calling them to pay their missionaries and send them to other areas of the world. It's a very challenging purpose or dream for us, but we are moving forward on that, calling everybody to help us and sending missionaries from everywhere to everywhere, because we are protagonists in the local mission, but we are also partners in the global mission. And you know, after some meetings and discussions, our divisions and institutions, they are planning to send in the next 5 years 295 missionaries sponsored by them to other areas, to areas that are outside of their territories, helping us to reach the world and prepare this world to the second coming of Jesus. This is the second wing. We are looking at the windshield, looking forward, dreaming big to the Lord. And the second major dream that we are working with is what we call the 3 mission windows. The first one is very known by all of you who are studying or preaching or reading about missiology, is the 1040 window. But we have 2 other windows that are very related to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is the post-Christian window and the urban window. And we are working very focused on these 3 different mission windows. When we think in the 1040 window, I don't need to talk about the 1040 window for you, because you are hearing about that all the time. But just paying attention on our reality. In the 1040 window, we have 60% of the world population, and only 12% of the Seventh-day Adventist membership. You can understand the size of our challenge when we think and when we talk about the 1040 window. When we think about the urban window, we have 55% of the world population living in the cities. They produce 80% of the wealth of this world, and they occupy only 3% of the world territory. You can understand how concentrated people are. It is a challenge, and at the same time, it's an opportunity for us. When we think in the reality of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, if we take into consideration all the cities with more than 1 million population, we have 49 of those cities with less than 10 Seventh-day Adventists. When we think in all those cities, we have 43 of them without Seventh-day Adventist presence. It means if we put both together, we have almost 100 cities with less than 10 or no Adventist presence. It's a huge challenge for us. And when we think in the post-Christian window, we are talking about 1.2 billion population. And if we can consider them as a religious group, they could be the third largest religious group in the world. We are looking at these 3 mission windows. We are very focused. Our priority is to send all our missionaries to these 3 mission windows around the world. It means we are looking at the windshield all the time, but a healthy church is looking at the windshield without taking off the eyes from the rear view mirror. And we are paying attention on what is coming behind. And today, and during these days, we will keep our eyes on the rear view mirror and remember what happened 150 years ago. And colleagues and friends, when we remember what happened 150 years ago, at least in my mind, 4 elements comes out immediately. Number 1, great leaders, they can make a positive difference for our worldwide mission. Why I'm saying that? Because when we started to discuss the sending of J. and Andrews, and we are celebrating his sending to the world 150 years ago, when we started to discuss that, the church faced a huge polemic, and it was very challenging to make a decision around that sending. It took 1 year to make the decision. But you know, at the last evening of GC session in 1874, George Butler, the president, he stood up and said, friends, he appealed to the delegates, we need to make a decision and send the missionary. And when the General Conference president, he stood up in front of the delegates and he appealed for the people, finally, after 1 year discussing, they made the decision, and that decision was to send J. and Andrews to Switzerland as soon as possible. In less than 1 month later, he was with his family in the port of Boston, and they left to Switzerland. Great leaders, they can make a positive difference. Second, we need the best resources. I'm talking about human resources. We need the best human resources in the field. You know, when we think about the challenge that we have in our local mission, they are huge. But when we think in the challenge that we have in the mission field, in the 3 windows that I mentioned to you, they are much bigger than the challenge that we have locally. It means we need to find the best people in our ranks to send to the field. And you remember that precious quotation from Ellen White, when she sent a letter for our brethren in Switzerland, and she said, after a strong criticism against J. and Andrews, she sent that letter and she said, we are sending to you the ablest men in our ranks. We need to pay attention on that. The best to the mission field. The third one, we need to pay tribute to our brave missionaries that are in the field. And you know the story of J. and Andrews. And the last one, I just need to remind you, crisis can't stop the mission. When J. and Andrews was sent to Switzerland, the church was facing a huge financial crisis. The church was not organized to send a missionary abroad, but by faith, Andrews was sent. And friends, we can move forward by faith, trusting in the honor of the mission. Well, we are here to learn more and more lessons from 150 years ago and keep our eyes on the rear view mirror, but always dreaming big to the Lord. Because of those missionaries, Andrews and others, today We are 23 million members. We are in 212 countries. And 94% of our membership is living outside the United States. Everything started 150 years ago. May God inspire all of you to keep your eyes at the mirror view, but dreaming big to the Lord and looking forward, keeping your eyes also in the windshield. Again, welcome, and may God bless all of you.
Good evening and welcome to Andrews University. We are so glad you're here. And what a fitting place to have this mission conference, because Andrews University and mission are inseparable. And I'd like to illustrate 2 or 3 ways why that is the case. First of all, as you probably noticed, we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of mission in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, when J.N. Andrews, his son and daughter, set out as the first missionaries in September 1874. This is also the 150th anniversary of Andrews University, which was established as Battle Creek College on August 24, 1874. It's no coincidence that both Adventist higher education and Adventist mission began 150 years ago at the same time. Because Adventist education is key to mission, and mission is essential for Adventist education. I'd like to also mention a couple of other things. You just heard about the ablest man in our ranks. Our namesake, John Nevins Andrews, was not only a missionary, he was also a scholar. And in fact, his work on the history of the Sabbath is, even today, a monumental work. And so scholarship and mission are connected. But something else, and you may not have heard this because it's a very little-known fact, and that is, at the General Conference in 1873, there was a motion made from the floor to establish the very first Seventh-day Adventist college. That motion, which was approved, was made by John Nevins Andrews. So as you can see, mission and Adventist education, this mission conference and Andrews University are inseparable. But there's something more. Both of these are milestones. The sesquicentennial of Adventist mission, the sesquicentennial of Andrews University. Milestones. But a milestone is not the destination. We have work to do. We have a mission to carry forward. And this conference is key to carrying forward that mission. So while certainly we will look back in the rearview mirror during this conference and remember how God has guided us in the past and the lessons, the insights that we have gained, in this conference we will also look to the future with confidence, because He who has guided us in the past will carry forward the work to completion. May God bless each of you in this conference, and welcome to Andrews.
And so we go straight into our first paper session, and each paper session will end with a discussion, and we want to discuss the things that interest you. So during the paper sessions, fill out your cards and bring them up here at the end of the paper session, and we will have a discussion with the panelists up here. Those panelists will be Dr. Gil Valentine first, a church historian, a retired university professor, but he was a missionary in Pakistan and Thailand, and an important author of several books, including this one. J.N. Andrews, mission pioneer, evangelist, and thought leader. The second speaker will be Dr. Trevor, also a church historian, a professor of church history, chair of the Department of Church History here at the SDA Theological Seminary at Andrews University, author of several books and articles, including one on Charles Kinney. The third speaker for the hour will be Dr. David Trim, a director of archives, statistics, and research for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Born to missionary parents in Bombay, India, he spent his childhood in Australia. He taught at Newbold College and then at Pacific Union College. And Dr. Trim is an author, co-author, editor, co-editor of 18 books and many other scholarly works. We will continue without further announcement until the discussion. Gil.
John and other organizers of the conference, thank you sincerely for the invitation to participate with you in the reflections on this very important weekend. I count it a great privilege. A vision for mission, John Andrews and the eschatological imperative. John Andrews' life-defining theological convictions were framed not just within a general premillennial eschatology, but were distinctively shaped by a very sharp focus on the imminence of the parousia. As an enthusiastic 14-year-old, Andrews had lived through the traumatic disappointments of autumn 1844 when Advent expectations had been dashed. But he had stubbornly refused to discard his hope. And although it had been a struggle to find satisfactory meaning in the fateful misunderstanding, he continued to hold on to that hope of the Advent. And at a point of discouragement 5 years later, in 1849, he linked himself to a circle of Sabbatarian Adventist leaders, Joseph Bates and Ellen and James White. Together, they mined for further meaning in their experience. Andrews became a missionary and a respected author, and in his extensive early publications, he vigorously defended their shared, continuing, imminent Advent hope, at the same time providing theological coherence to Adventism's emerging cluster of distinctive doctrinal convictions. These doctrines were embraced in his teaching on the three angels' messages of Revelation 14, 6-12, which he articulated clearly in a set of articles in 1851, 1852, and then in book form in 1854 and 1855. His exposition of Revelation 14 was anchored in the conviction that the messages of the first two angels had already been completed. The third message, with its final dreadful warning that judgment had already started upon the world and was proceeding apace in real time, it would be completed shortly. Had not the messenger of Revelation 10:6 declared, in the language of their King James Version, that there would be time no longer? Andrews took that declaration seriously. It was an anchor point for his thinking. Gospel mission to the world, he believed, had already been completed. That task was behind them. Andrews and his fellow Sabbatarian Adventists viewed their future preaching just the third message as within a very short chronology. Months, weeks, not years. But then, remarkably, in 1874, we find him with undimmed conviction of an imminent end, undertaking his mission across the seas to Europe. How did he make that transition? And how did his fellow believers make that transition? This paper seeks to understand the nature and the basis of Andrew's intense sense of imminent eschatology and consider how it shaped his personal spiritual experience and motivated his 1874 mission to Europe. Keeping an eschatological vision for mission, however, was not without its problems. John Andrews' conviction that he was living in the very last days of Earth history was grounded in the historicist interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. The 1260 days had pointed to 1798 as the beginning of the time of the end. And then Daniel 8:14 had pointed them to 1843 and then 1844. And James White, reluctant to let that go, considered his structure of 4 watches of the night still to be finished and looked to 1845 for a finish. But Sabbatarian Adventists soon abandoned precise date setting for the coming of the Lord, even as they earnestly strove to maintain the sharp sense of imminence. For early Adventists like John Andrews, it was imminence that comprised the distinctive core of the meaning of the movement, providing its essential raison d'etre. As James White would assert in 1873, just the year before Andrews went to Europe, the idea of imminence was easy to defend from Scripture, and it was important that they do so, even after 30 years. Without the conviction of imminence, he wrote, the entire movement must be an inexplicable delusion. It would not be credible. Thus, the conviction concerning the imminent appearing of Christ and the fiery end of the world became a litmus test for Adventist orthodoxy in the early days. How to maintain imminence without date setting, that was a challenge. Review and Herald editor Uriah Smith would claim that the movement's ability to maintain a sense of imminence without actually setting a date for the Advent was a clear mark of its distinction from other Advent awakening movements. Of all the Advent papers published, he said, he would boast, this is in 1870, that our church paper occupied a consistent position on the Advent question. It did not set dates. For those Adventists who did continue to set dates, the stately tread of time had turned their ignoble theories into mother dust, he wrote. Sabbatarian Adventists had avoided this embarrassment. No such incubus of multiplied failures bedeviled the Sabbatarian Adventist cause, to which he had committed his all. And yet maintaining imminence without date setting was not easy. And ironically, even for Smith and for Andrews, it would involve approaching as near as possible to setting a specific time for the Advent, stopping just short of putting a number for a date on it. For example, in 1870, Uriah Smith was certain that the Advent was going to occur in 1871, and he wrote an article piling evidence upon evidence upon evidence, thinking that that next year, 1871, would be the end. It didn't happen, and the tread of time continued. As we have noticed, Andrews believed that the announcement of the angel of Revelation 10:6 that time should be no longer was of preeminent importance. We firmly believe, he wrote in his book in 1854, that this proclamation has been made and the preaching of the immediate advent of our Lord has been the fulfillment of prophecy. The very end of time was upon them. But had the message of the first angel, with its worldwide proclamation of the gospel, really been proclaimed in all the world? Andrews asked that question of his readers in his 1854 book. Has it been given to all the nations of the earth? We used to think that, yes, we could say yes, because the nations of the world were living in America and we'd reached all of them. Andrews didn't take that route. He argued in the affirmative and provided 12 pages of evidence in his book that proved 16 different reports he cited that the worldwide distribution of Millerite literature and Millerite Advent preaching in far-flung places proved that the gospel had been preached. None can deny, he wrote, that this worldwide warning of impending judgment has been given. First angel's message was in the past. So too was the second angel's message about the fall of Babylon, fulfilled within just a few years, he wrote in 1855. because the popular churches had rejected the Advent year. The remaining time was very short. The period of the third angel's proclamation could not last long because the generation who had turned their backs on the Advent message and rejected it 10 years previously were the ones who were going to experience the last plagues. The math was not difficult. The focus of preaching was not now the gospel per se, but the task of the Advent preacher was to give the somber warning of the third angel, a warning of dark judgment. John Andrews' eschatology was in general not a bright picture. A close reading of his theological publications revealed a steely focus on the hope of the advent of Christ, but it was not conveyed with an intense concern of cheerful hope as a fear of a fiery end. And his relatives and his neighbours interpreted it that way, as the neighbours lived across the road from where he and his family lived. You'll read that story in the biography of Andrews. But his childhood upbringing, his fear of the judgment, his New England concern with duty, and the flip side of that, guilt if you don't complete your duty, and his emphasis on the perpetuity of the law and the exacting standard, all made the end for John Andrews rather dark. As the years passed, there were challenges to imminence and a need to explain the delay. In 1867, it had been whispered around New England, according to Stephen Haskell, that Stephen Pierce, a respected Advent preacher from New Hampshire, was failing the litmus test of strong belief in imminence. Rumour had it that Pierce had not much faith in the near coming of the Lord because he had begun to believe that the truth must go to different sections of Europe. 1867. And we must have some place to educate men in other tongues. Such a venture would take time, and it would suggest that the Advent was at least several years in the future. That could sound like heresy. The development of the health work in Battle Creek a year earlier had already centre-staged a challenge to the concept of imminence. Health reform was important as in an eschatological context, where it was considered as preparation for translation, but when it extended to investing in a health institute with expensive buildings, with wards and clinics, and the need for trained personnel, it posed a serious threat to the sharp edge of imminence. Some questioned the development of a health institute for that very reason. A few years after the health work began, the church in 1872 confronted the challenge of another institution to build, with its challenge to the sense of imminence. It became necessary, as our university president has mentioned, to establish an educational institution that involved longer range courses. And some opposed the idea of a college for that reason. It too seemed to postpone the Advent. And the dilemma was made more paradoxical and acute by the fact that in the first instance, the primary objective for establishing the denomination's first school was to educate missionaries. A place was urgently needed to train students who were coming to Battle Creek from overseas to learn more about Adventism and to learn the English language in order to go back overseas to preach in foreign lands. And the fact that the students were due to arrive in Michigan sometime in mid-1872 gave the project urgency. 2 years later, as church leaders rushed to complete a larger, more accommodating building in 1874, they were promising that the courses would not be long. Why? Because they didn't want to give the idea of extended time. And, in fact, they were already looking for language teachers for that very first school, those very first classes. Language teachers for German, French, Swedish and Danish, besides our own language. By the summer of 1874, as Andrews was readying to depart for Europe, competent teachers in the languages had already been hired. "We mean business," reported President George Butler, thankful to those church members who had supported the rapidly implemented initiative to prepare workers to send to proclaim the truth to other nations. So the sense of imminence was thus a vital factor driving Sabbatarian Adventism's widening sense of mission. I want to make that clear. Even paradoxically, as the very widening of mission was subtly implying postponing the Advent and setting up a tension with a sharp sense of imminence. The existentially freighted implications of the delay in the Advent posed by the building of institutions and an expanding mission were not new. From the very beginning, the Church had found it necessary to adopt explanations for the delay in the realization of the Advent hope, while at the same time still keeping the sense of imminence alive. Explaining the delay had become an essential precondition of the movement's development. Between 1844 and 1874, Church leaders developed 7 different explanatory motifs as to why the delay had happened. And each of those motifs was succeeded by a later one, because the problem of delay was real. Those conceptual mechanisms served as explanations, but they kept the focus on imminence and eschatology. The mission to Europe and imminent eschatology. It was not so much the imminent Advent hope, but a shared interest in seventh-day Sabbath keeping that lay behind the first inquiries from Sabbath keepers in Europe to Adventists in the late 1860s. And it was that created the opportunity for an expanded worldwide mission. Sabbath keepers were how the Swiss believers were called and distinguished. And in the years that followed immediately, newly discovered other groups of Sabbath keepers provided further openings for mission. When John Andrews made his way to Europe in 1874, he stopped off in England en route to reinforce an already established connection with Seventh-day Baptists, and then spent several weeks following up scattered Sabbath keepers elsewhere in the British Isles. His initial evangelistic outreach involved advertising in national newspapers, seeking to contact people who were interested in the Sabbath or who might already be keeping Sabbath. But it was the eschatological significance of the duty to keep Sabbath that was Andrews' primary motivation. Andrews wanted to turn Sabbath keepers into Sabbath-keeping Adventists in preparation for the Day of Judgment. And his willingness to undertake the challenge of the mission to Switzerland in 1874 was motivated by that deep conviction. And the church in Battle Creek that sent him shared that conviction. Let me zero in briefly on John Andrews' own personal sense of imminence in 1874. John Andrews spent his first Sabbath after his arrival in Switzerland on October 17, 1874. Did you look at your calendar today? This day, 150 years ago, John Andrews spent his first Sabbath with the Sabbath keepers in Albert Vumier's 3-story home in Lakeside, Neuchâtel. Speaking through a translator, he narrated a brief history of the work of Joseph Bates and James and Ellen White and the beginnings of the Advent movement and the importance of the Sabbath. 6 days later, on Thursday, October 22, which happened to be the 30th anniversary of the memorable 10th day of the 7th month, as he looked out over the crowded city from his 3rd-floor apartment window, Andrews was awed by the enormity of the task and the shortness of time to complete it. God has given to the Seventh-day Adventists a work of immense magnitude and of vast importance, he reflected in an article he wrote that day. That work was to give warning to the world of the near advent of Christ and to teach the true preparation for that great event. Only Seventh-day Adventists had any just idea of the strict examination of our lives in the light of God's holy law, when he shall bring into judgment every work. He understood, as he looked out at the houses around him that day, that the task would not be easy, not congenial. But in spite of this, the work needed to be taken on with great urgency, he wrote. For we have the clearest evidence from the prophetic portion of Scriptures that the Son of God will shortly return. The Advent was swiftly approaching. Repeatedly in this article written on that day, 30 years after 1844, he referred to the theme of sharp imminence. The time for this work is short. Our time to work is short. The day of God is hastening. The end will be very soon. Eschatology clearly was the energizing driver of this new venture in mission. And I'm aware of the imminence of the end of my time here, so I'll proceed quickly. What about his fellow believers in 1874? In the middle of 1874, as delegates convened for the General Conference session that would make the decision to send Andrews to Europe, Smith gave the front page of the Review to a discussion of a debate that Daniel Bordeaux had in Chicago. And the debate had been to defend the immediacy of the coming of Christ. That was the context in which John Andrews was sent. As editor Uriah Smith wound up volume 43 of the Review in mid-June 1874, he interpreted the new opportunities for mission as a fulfillment of the precious hope of the church so long sacredly cherished. 2 weeks later, Joseph Clark would again argue that the 19th century would be the closing one for Earth. And we, in 1874, he said, are truly near its close. Events were proving with fearful certainty the truth of prophecy that the end was near. In the months immediately after Andrew's arrival in Switzerland, as he began sending back reports of his first experiences in this new mission, the Review continued to publish clusters of articles that stressed the nearness of the Advent and linked them with the new mission endeavour and other notable developments in the work. Keeping the edge on imminence sharply honed was important, but not so sharp that it became counterproductive, and that was a problem for those early believers. In 1873, Uriah Smith had made a big thing in the Review about the Battle of Armageddon not being far away. He thought 1873. In 1876, while Andrews is struggling to keep his mission afloat with limited finance, Uriah Smith publishes in the Review a report that the nations of Europe are slicing up Turkey, the Ottoman Empire is about to fall, and the Battle of Armageddon is just on the horizon. Not over the horizon, on the horizon. The high sense of imminent eschatology, of eschatological imminence, generated by his reading of the prophecies of Daniel 11, reached fever pitch. And that posed problems for James White, who had the very practical administrative problem of raising funds to pay debts on his publishing house and debts on the church and to build new churches and to send more missionaries. Thinking that the Battle of Armageddon was just over the horizon made fundraising exceptionally difficult. And so James White sought to lower the temperature in November 1876 by publicly challenging Uriah Smith in a Sabbath morning sermon. Later, in a review article, he did the same, urging a less imminent interpretation of the prophecies. And that brought a rebuke from his wife, who protested that he should not engage in such public debate. The Eastern question, which had to do with the Battle of Armageddon, however, made very good evangelistic advertising for Daniel Bordeaux, who is now in Europe and running evangelistic campaigns. A good opening night address. Conclusion. Adventist worldwide mission was birthed in the swaddling clothes of a sharp-edged, imminent eschatology. Our early evangelists and leaders gave themselves unremittingly to preaching the message of the Advent near. As the years passed and hopes began to stretch out unfulfilled, they found it necessary to adopt explanatory rubrics that explained the delay and yet still maintained for them a sense of imminent expectation. That kind of eschatology continued to serve as the launch pad for their preaching, even as they found it necessary to build institutions that would further their cause, even as they found it necessary to expand their vision of what world mission would involve. Exposure to new challenges in mission would lead to further reflection on and adaptation of the message they felt called to proclaim. In 2024, we continue to be challenged by yet new fields of mission, as Elder Kohler has pointed out to us, with new demands. May we be as creative and as committed as our pioneers were, with a deep sense of urgency, creativity, and commitment. May we be as committed as that now, 150 years later. God bless.
I want to extend my greetings and welcome to all of you who are here. I want to give a special shout out to the president of my home union, Pastor Everett Brown. Before I give my presentation today, I thought I'd give you a short testimony that provide context for you. I am from Kingston, Jamaica, and in 1971, I was baptized along with 17 other members of my family. In fact, this story actually became a mission story entitled Modern Miracles in Jamaica. It was actually published in 1975. My mother, who owned a business, sold her business, and she became a Bible worker and an itinerant evangelist. She brought a megaphone and she preached on the buses, on the train. In fact, I want to show you a picture of her here. They call her the Ellen White of Jamaica back in those days because she went about preaching and she converted her mother and other members of the family. She was so passionate, and that's where I got my sense of calling from. And 7 years ago, unfortunately, she passed away, but I will always remember my mother. Out of that campaign, we established a church in Jamaica called the New Haven Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it's actually the first church that you'll see coming in the city from the west. Still remains as a memorial of that incredible event. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the strongest religious organizations in the tropical paradise of Jamaica. With a population of 2.8 million, there are over 340,000 Adventists, which is around, 12% of the population, which means that it has one of the highest ratios of Adventists in the world. By any measurement, Adventism has been tremendously successful in this small country, and having left Jamaica some 47 years ago, I thought it would be a good research project to understand the roots and the development of Adventism. My presentation is basically in three parts. First, I'm going to basically describe for you a little bit of the history of Adventist mission and how the methodology of Adventist mission developed. Secondly, I'll talk about the exportation of that methodology to Jamaica. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the factors that brought about this development of Adventism in Jamaica. The history of Adventist mission. When the Sabbatarian Adventists began talk about mission, they actually had no sense of mission. Between the years 1844 and 1850, they were considered anti-mission because they felt that probation has closed. But between 1850 and 1874, they believed that the door was partially open, and so the mission was confined primarily to the home front. From 1874 to 1889, they began to embrace mission, but this was limited primarily to what we call Protestant European countries. And this is the time that they sent Jane Andrews to Europe. In the 1890s is the decade that they began to embrace this concept of global mission. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this methodology of mission that was established. According to George Knight, he identified what he calls the Adventist missiological program as a missiological quadrilateral. which means that the Adventist mission consists of 4 dimensions. There was the publishing dimension, the health dimension, the education, and of course, church organization. Now, Knight points out that this did not come out of conscious design, but it primarily arose out of the fact that the Adventists had a very holistic view of human nature. And the genesis of this quadrilateral view did not happen overnight. In the year 1848, Ellen White had a vision. I'm going to quote a part of the vision. She says, "I have a message for you. You must begin to print a little paper and send it out to the people. Let it be small at first, but as the people read, they will send you means by which to print, and it will be a success from the first. From this small beginning, it was shown to me to be like streams of light that went clear around the world." Her husband listened to his wife's counsel and started a periodical called Present Truth. Later on, he started a second periodical called the Advent Review, which became known as the Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. And these periodicals form the first stage of this missiological quadrilateral. Then the growth of the strong publishing work led to the development of the second stage of Adventist, this quadrilateral design. The publishing work created a sense of unity in the organization and led to property acquisition, which necessitated a name and a legal cooperation under the state. And therefore, this first concrete step eventually would lead to a legal denomination, and of course, later on to the establishment of conferences, and of course, the General Conference there. That's the second step. The third phase of this quadrilateral followed on the heels of the second one. In fact, on June 6, 1863, she had another vision concerning health reform, and I'm quoting part of the vision now. "I saw that it was a sacred duty to attend to our health and arouse others to their duty. We have a duty to speak and to come out against intemperance of every kind, intemperance in working and eating and drinking. And I saw that we should not be silent upon the subject of health, but should wake up the minds to this subject." And so Ellen White begins to link health reform to missions, and this becomes the third stage in this missiological quadrilateral. The fourth and final dimension of this mission quadrilateral took place, of course, between 1872 and 1874 with the establishment of the Battle Creek College in 1874. Thus, by 1874, the Seventh-day Adventist Church had all 4 pieces of this quadrilateral in place: the publishing arm to spread the message, the medical branch to prepare lives and the hearts of people, and its educational work to train workers and nourish young believers, and a conference system to coordinate all of these activities. I want to talk about now exporting this quadrilateral to Jamaica. This quadrilateral model would be exported to Jamaica and would replicate these 4 dimensions. The work began with the publishing ministry. It was under the work of the colporteurs, but unlike Jamaica, it would be the first and the most important factor in laying the foundations for the Jamaican Adventism. But the focus of the work in Jamaica would not be on establishing publishing institutions, but simply using colporteurs, book canvases, to spread Adventist literature all over the island. The second leg of this quadrilateral focused on conference organization, and 10 years after the first Adventist missionary landed in Jamaica, they formed the first conference in Jamaica. I want to just read in a general meeting in 1903 here. "Our workers are all united in the idea that a time has come in the progress of the cause in Jamaica when a conference organization, assisted, though it must be for the present, from the mission board's fund, would prove educational value to the field and would help to lay responsibilities for the church." So the third development of Adventism in Jamaica was education. This time they recognized that the need for a college. And so very early, in fact, only 5 years after the missionary landed in Jamaica, they start thinking about this. And in 1906, they bought a piece of land and began to establish a college. I'll talk about that just a little bit later. The final dimension of this quadrilateral was probably the weakest aspect of this in the Jamaican mission field, and that is the health dimension. It was not until 1945 that they actually built the first hospital in Jamaica and began to spread the Adventist health message as such. I want to talk a little bit now about how the beginnings of this. There are many versions of this particular story. I'm going to give you the very short version here. Henry Palmer obviously was receiving Adventist literature, and he began to send some of these literature to his son, William Palmer, in Jamaica at the time. And he began reading this literature, and he began to make contact with the publishers at the time, the International Tract Society, and they began corresponding between themselves there. Then Henry Palmer the son, William Palmer, begins to gather a small group of people at his home and begin to teach them some of the Adventist ideas. Later on, a book was sent by his father called The Coming King, in which he became convicted on the Sabbath doctrine. He also received a number of tracts again from overseas, and he began to share some of this information with his doctor, for example, Dr. Ross. And it so happened that one of the patients of Dr. Ross, Mrs. Margaret Harrison, got a hold of one of the tracts on the Sabbath, took it home, and she actually became convinced of the Sabbath at the time, and she still went to her church. And so on one Sunday, her pastor was preaching a sermon on the commandments, and then came to the Sabbath, and the conviction hit Mrs. Harrison that the Sabbath is to be kept. And so she left her church and began keeping the Sabbath. She heard about the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and she actually came to America. This is a white Jamaican woman who was of the upper class, so she had the means to do it. She came here to be treated, and while she was here in Battle Creek in 1893, she actually attended the General Conference session, and she asked for a worker to be sent to Jamaica to help to establish the work, which they did. A.J. Hamesmer and his family came to Jamaica in 1893 to sort of establish the Adventist work there. I'd like to just read from a quotation by Herbert Fletcher, one of the early pastors here. He says, in very poetic language, "In the waters of the Caribbean, nestled in her arms, are the romantic isles of the West Indies. No grander sight can greet the eye than the rays of the rising sun reflected in the water of the sea. As it scatters it fills everywhere with light and glory. So it was early in the 90s when the rays of the third angel's message penetrated beyond the shores of America, and glorious was the dawning of that morn on the fair island of Jamaica." This was from Pastor Herbert Fletcher, one of the early pastors there at the time, reflecting on the joy and wonder of receiving the Advent message. Now, in this part of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the factors. There are three categories of factors here that sort of propel the growth of Adventism in Jamaica. There is what I call the direct factors around the missiological quadrilateral, and then there are indirect factors, and then there's a theological dimension to this. Number one, perhaps the single most important factor in establishing the work in Jamaica was the role of the printed press, the printed page. From the very inception and throughout the history of the work, the role of Adventist literature and the work of both canvasser and colporteur were pivotal. In fact, when we became Adventists in 1971, we looked in our library and discovered that we had two Adventist books. Apparently, a colporteur had passed through and sold us the book Hope of the Race and Bible Readings for the Home. We were quite surprised. So we know that these colporteurs went far and wide throughout Jamaica spreading the word. In fact, when Haysmer gave a report concerning, he said these words: as a result of the efforts put forth in the island to scatter the truth among the people for the last 4.5 years, he's going to sort of give you a enumeration of some of the things. There are 18,000 signs of the times and other periodicals, 510,000 pages of pamphlets and tracts, 2,670 copies of Patriarchs and Prophets, 450 copies of Prophecies of Jesus. He went down the list of many of these Adventist books showing how they had spread all across Jamaica. I think one of the most interesting enlightenment about the impact of the literature and Adventism was a report made by a Catholic priest. And I want you to listen to what he says here. He says, the Seventh-day Adventists carry on a very clever propaganda to win converts to their faith. The most powerful lever in winning people is the kind of literature they produce. It is written in a subtle way, creating in part of the people a strong desire to read more of the literature until they are fully persuaded, and undermining the belief of our church members. We don't mind their preaching as much. It is their literature that gives us trouble. We find it everywhere. These people have sold 6,000 worth of their literature in this district, and the worst part of it is our members of the Greek Catholic Church have purchased this literature, whereas they have hardly purchased $1 worth of Catholic literature. So you can see, folks, the literature evangelists, their work was tremendous in establishing the work. A second factor is the focus on lay leadership. A second major factor that contributed to the success of Adventism in Jamaica was the early focus on lay leadership. They embraced the work with enthusiasm and passion. These lay leaders, women and men went about preaching, teaching, giving Bible study, engaging in house-to-house work, doing public evangelism, and they didn't wait for permission from the conference or from the pastor. I have my own experience to share with you. When we were living in Jamaica, my mom had a burden for a particular community, and she went to that community one day, spoke with a woman, and said, listen, I want to start a church right here. And the lady said, no problem. She opened up her backyard to us. We put up a shack, and my stepfather became the preacher. My mother and I were the Bible workers. And we started a church. In fact, I know Pastor Brown knows a church. This is how the Bushy Park Seventh-day Adventist Church was established. The lay people in Jamaica, they had this tremendous, powerful enthusiasm and passion for the work. And so very early, the leaders in the church recognized that it was the lay leaders who would lead out in the establishment of the church. Another factor in the spread of the work in Jamaica was the deep spirituality of the Jamaican people. Jamaica was and still is a culture that is deeply spiritual. People who believe in the power of prayer and hard work. They engage in the work as if their success depended on their efforts, and they pray as if it depended upon God. There are many, many reports given by many of the leaders. In fact, President Spicer extolled the pioneering spirit of the Jamaican work and the tremendous benefit of the canvassing work. He described their courage and their zeal and their deep appreciation for the Advent message. He identified something that would carve a special place in the history of the Adventist mission. He saw Jamaica, this is President Spicer, as an ideal place for developing workers for all the tropical fields, including Africa in particular. He says, as the work grows in Jamaica, I believe it will furnish us faithful and disciplined workers for other fields. In fact, Jamaica would become the center for much of the work in Inter-American Division there. A fourth factor in the spreading of the work in Jamaica was the organization of conference. Yes, I'm kind of behind on this slide here. The organization of conference, 10 years after Haysman landed in Jamaica, they organized a conference. In fact, in 1895, there were only 102 members, but by 1903, they had 1,200 members. In fact, there was decision made very early to establish an organizational structure in Jamaica to advance the work. So the conference organization becomes very important. And a fifth factor in the establishing the work was the establishment of a training school. Education has always been a vital part of Adventist mission outreach, and it played a critical role in the success of the work in Jamaica. The need for educating Adventist young people and the establishment of a college for the training of workers was evident very early in the Adventist work in Jamaica. And as I said, by 1898, they were talking about establishing this college there in Jamaica. All right, I'm a little bit behind on this here. Okay. So the greatest need, however, for the Jamaican Adventists was the need for a training college to train workers to establish the work on a firmer footing in Jamaica. Nothing could boost the work more than the establishment of such a college. So by 1906, they had bought a property in Jamaica, and around 1918, they established the college that we now know in Mandeville, and that becomes critical in the advancement of the work there in Jamaica. I just want to read something here. It says, the role that the college has played in the success and consolidation of the work in Jamaica is incalculable. The college provided a cadre of well-trained, qualified workers that helped to advance the work not only in Jamaica but in the surrounding region. It was a source of continual inspiration for the young people, giving them a hope of advancing themselves not only spiritually but materially also. It was a magnet for youth all around the region who came in their numbers, bringing with them their unique cultures and languages to the college, thus enshrining the educational experience of their Jamaican colleagues. The college provided Jamaica with a global vision of the work, for it attracted many foreign workers who came to share their gifts and talents. The college provided continuing education to workers. The college also became important in the Jamaican context because it was seen as an important asset in nation building. The sixth factor is the aggressive public evangelism in Jamaica. Very early, the Adventists in Jamaica began to engage in what we call tent evangelism. Elder R.F. Richardson, an American missionary, was the first to pitch a tent for public evangelism. It says, the first tent meeting by F.R.I. Richardson would mark the beginning of an evangelistic explosion that is now part of the storied legacy of Adventist evangelism in Jamaica. All across the island, for the next 100 years, laymen and pastors alike would engage in this method of evangelism on an aggressive scale that would be brought to pass the words of Jesus, on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I'm going to look now briefly at what I call the indirect factors that may have helped in the advancement of the work in Adventism. All right. See, I'm way behind on this. All right, the indirect factors. There are a number of factors that may be considered direct factors, but the accident of geography. Jamaica is in close proximity to the United States, the birthplace of Adventism. The travel time from America to Jamaica was relatively short. The missionaries could come and go and return home for rest and rejuvenation. Proximity, not just in distance, but in culture, language, religion, and custom made the transition and the adaptation much easier for both missionary and the new believers. Jamaica is the largest English-speaking country in the Caribbean, and also was the center of British colonial rule in the region. So Jamaicans shared a common cultural and linguistic heritage with the Americans. English was the major language spoken, so there was no need for the missionaries to learn a new language. So, furthermore, since the vast majority of Adventist literature and books were written in English, these materials were readily available to the new believers in large quantity to speed up the process of indoctrination. The short travel time also accelerated the process. The missionaries themselves, once they arrived in Jamaica, could immediately begin preaching, traveling, and instructing the native workers and believers. The similarity also in in religious heritage. This was a Protestant country, and people were very receptive to Adventism because of the similarity in the heritage here. I'm going to move on to what I call the final factor, and that is the truth and the prophetic factor, the theological factor. Adventism, I remember as a boy when we received Adventism there in 1971, we didn't think of this as just becoming part of another church. I mean, we were members of the Anglican Church. We saw Adventism as, in fact, we said we became part of the great Advent movement. That's what my mother, that was a term she used. We were part of a movement. This sense of, we saw this church as a fulfillment of prophecy. This sense of this apocalyptic nature of this church, its prophetic urgency, I mean, sort of gave us this sense of passion that this is where we belong. This is the sense of the truth that activated the mind and soul. And one of the beautiful things about Adventism was that it was very holistic in its approach. Education, health, spirituality. It touched on all of the various dimensions of human existence. And so as a boy, I readily joined up. And I'm just happy to say that I continue this journey here, and it's been a great privilege to share with you in this particular presentation how the mission of Adventism in Jamaica has been a tremendous success. I want to just finish with this one final paragraph. The Adventist mission experience in Jamaica followed the missiological quadrilateral as proposed by George Knight, has proven to be an incredible success. Adventism has been enthusiastically embraced by many Jamaicans and is today the largest denomination in the country. The Prime Minister has an Adventist background, the Governor General has an Adventist background, and most people in Jamaica are aware of the tremendous work that the Adventists are doing in Jamaica. Thank you very much.
Is there a control for them? Good evening. So I'm going to talk about Adventist city missions. Tomorrow my colleague Gary Krause will talk about the present and the future. This evening I'm talking about the early history of Seventh-day Adventist city mission. Let us start with a powerful testimony of Ellen White's. If the remote will work. Where should I point it, John? Up, okay. She says, there is no change in the messages that God has sent in the past. The work in the cities is the essential work for this time. But let's dig deeper beneath that memorable statement. Notice the words, there is no change in God's message about big cities. This comes from a letter to the brethren leading the General Conference, written in June 1909, immediately after the close of that year's General Conference session. The timing reflected her frustration at the session's failure to act for the cities, a frustration she expressed very frankly, rebuking the GC President A.G. Daniels and Vice President W.W. Prescott by name. In particular, she observed, as I look over the past testimonies, I see that for years the importance of working the cities has been urged, but excuses have been made, and this great work has been sadly neglected. As Ellen White's words of 1909 imply, urban-focused mission has a long history in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Our pioneers established many city missions. In the time available this evening, I will simply delineate the main contours of the early history and draw out some points that are potentially relevant to urban mission today. Our history has much to offer, and not only in terms of learning lessons. Our history can inspire us, but it can also chasten us. And this presentation may do both. As you will see, historically we have engaged with the cities, sometimes. And sometimes we've done so in innovative and creative ways. City mission is not something new, not something that is a distraction. It is something that is deep in our DNA. Ellen White began directing Adventists to the cities at a relatively early stage. On March 31st, 1874, I dreamed, she wrote the next day, that several of our brethren were in council considering plans of labor. But the plans put forth were timid, including in their rejection of working in large cities, and they were rebuked by a heavenly messenger. The whole world, he said, is God's great vineyard. The angel continued, so she reported, the cities constitute a part of that vineyard. These must be worked and not passed by. It took time, however, for her message to be taken to heart. Finally, in 1883, so 9 years later, the denomination founded 2 city missions in Chicago and New York. The Chicago mission was funded jointly by the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois conferences. The New York City mission was at least partially funded by the General Conference, for it spent $3,004.52 on the mission in 1884. That doesn't sound very much, but it was 23% of the GC's annual budget. In November 1884, at the round of meetings associated with the General Conference session, the International Tract Society received reports on newly founded missions in Oakland, Portland, and Denver, and discussed prospects for founding one in New Orleans. But what did these early city missions actually do? Reports to the Tract and Missionary Society meeting reveal that city work largely meant systematic visitation of people's homes to conduct Bible studies. But the early city missions were also already trying to meet a range of felt needs, including social ones. Thus, in the 1884 reports, it was noted that donations of bedding, fruit, flour, potatoes, etc. would be very acceptable. In seeking to meet more than spiritual needs, urban missionaries were doing something different by Adventist standards. Yet that was also true of their emphasis on evangelizing through visitation and Bible study, for as leaders of the time recognized, this approach in big cities differed from that used in smaller towns, which revolved around series of public lectures in halls or tents. Thus, Adventist mission in its early days was innovative. Only a few months after the 1884 session, Ellen White again addressed the subject of city mission in a testimony written to R.F. Andrews, president of the Illinois Conference, to reprove his lukewarm or negative attitude to the Chicago mission. Ellen White poses rhetorical questions, following up with powerful reproofs. What account shall we give for the men and women who have died without hearing the sound of present truth, who would have received it had the light been brought to them? My spirit is stirred that the work in Chicago has been delayed so long. The work that is now being done there might have been done years ago. It must not be left undone now. And she continues, shall the prince of darkness be left in undisputed possession of our great cities because it costs something to sustain missions? Let those who would follow Christ fully come up to the work, even if it be over the heads of ministers and presidents. Some months later, in November 1885, the 24th General Conference session took up city missions with enthusiasm, adopting 14 recommendations. The first was that each conference with large cities have in its bounds at least one mission. Friends, this would be ambitious even today. We don't have that yet. In addition, at a time when the whole denomination employed fewer than 400 workers, the session mandated the dispatch of considerable personnel resources to big cities. The New England and New York conferences between them had a total of 20 workers, but they were instructed to furnish at least half a dozen more for the New York City Mission. There were just 3 ministers and 4 local churches in the entire Virginia conference, and no churches or workers in Maryland, but 2 ministers and 2 nurses were now newly assigned to Washington, D.C. There were only 3 ministers across the whole of the Deep South, but 3 ministers were assigned to start work in New Orleans. The 1886 yearbook included a first ever report of city missions listing 31 separate missions, 26 in the United States and 5 overseas, 1 each in Denmark, Sweden and Australia, plus 2 in England. An overall statistical report for the North American missions was included, which states that these 26 missions had a total workforce of 76 experienced workers, thanks to whose labors 446 people had embraced the truth during the last year. The 26th General Conference session of 1887 was the first to meet in a large city, convening in Oakland, California. Perhaps as a result, it created a new officer position. So this is in addition to the President, Secretary, and Treasurer, the Home Mission Secretary, who was instructed to devote his time principally to the furtherance of city mission work in the coming year. And here you see the yearbook's report of city missions for 1887, in the 1887 yearbook. The same year, it included 6 more missions in North America. The next year, 1888, the session again went to a major urban area, meeting in Minneapolis. While that 27th session is generally remembered for theological and intergenerational conflict, it was notable for a report delivered by the Home Mission Secretary, Eugene W. Farnsworth, specifically on work in U.S. cities for a 9-month period ending June 30, 1888. It reported 22 city missions in North America, with 131 workers engaged in Bible work at some time during the year, who had made 43,021 visits to 10,353 families. There had been 258 baptisms during the 9 months covered by Farnsworth's report, and he believed that fully 1,000 persons have been converted since these missions began their work. In 1889, notable evangelistic efforts were held in St. Louis, led by Charles M. Kinney, the first black Adventist ordained minister, and in Louisville, Kentucky, led by Alonzo Barry. These missions were aimed at African Americans. They used public evangelistic methods, literature evangelism, and personal visitation, but they also utilized soup kitchens and adult literacy classes to supply the immediate physical needs of a community which, by definition, was impoverished and lacked social support networks. This more socially inflected and comprehensive approach to urban ministry, introduced in working for African Americans, was adopted more widely in Adventist city missions. In 1893, it was adopted in Chicago with the creation of the famous Lifeboat Mission, sponsored by the International Medical Missionary and Benevolent Association and led by Dr. John Kellogg. This model spread and received prophetic endorsement. In the winter of 1894-95, the Review and Herald published a 3-part series of articles by Ellen White, who by then was serving as a missionary in Australia. The series had the title, Our Duty to the Poor and Afflicted. In the first article, Mrs. White quotes Isaiah 1:17, "Learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow." and then starkly declares, "Can we wonder that the curse of God is upon the earth, upon man and beast, when his law is set aside as a thing of naught, and men are following the imagination of their own hearts, as did the inhabitants of the world before the flood? All this foretells the coming of Christ and the end of all things." But what is highly unusual by the standards of Adventist theological discourse is that here Ellen White links setting aside the law of God as naught, not to the fourth commandment, nor indeed to any of the 10 commandments, but rather to failing to live up to Old Testament injunctions to care for the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. Mrs. White drives the point home. Through selfish pride, she writes, through selfish gratification, the blessing of God has been shut away from men and from his professed people because they have despised his words and have failed to relieve the sufferings of humanity. And here you see the quotation that provides the title of my paper. Ellen White is telling us that the test of whether we are guilty of selfish pride and selfish gratification and of despising God's words is whether we do or do not relieve the sufferings of humanity. John Kellogg declared that he would use our duty to the poor and afflicted as a blueprint for the Chicago mission. And sure enough, a year later in 1896, the Lifeboat Mission created a maternity home for prostitutes who gave birth out of wedlock and a working men's home for unemployed laborers. In 1897, the earliest Adventist welfare organization outside America was founded in Hamburg, Germany. In 1898, the Beau Bazaar Mission in Calcutta, headed by Doris Robinson, included an orphanage and a vegetarian restaurant and cooking school. In 1897 and 98, in city missions in Portland, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco, they were, according to an official report, places where unfortunates can find food and lodging. Many have been supplied with clothing and made comfortable during sickness. Elsewhere in the US West, there was a working men's home in Spokane, Washington, but there was also one in Melbourne, Australia. In 1899, in Montgomery, Alabama, a black pastor, T.S. Bucknor, opened the Montgomery Charity Mission, which not only dispersed aid to the African American community, but also included a school for them. Meanwhile, the San Francisco mission had expanded considerably. Its origins lay in an 1887 initiative by the San Francisco Church that won the support of that year's GC session in nearby Oakland. In the late 1890s, it expanded, operating a hygienic restaurant, a healthy food store, treatment rooms, a working men's home, a sailor's ministry, a school, and an orphanage. Ellen White commended what was happening in San Francisco and urged that this approach be widely emulated. That these were concerted efforts, not outliers, is evident from an address to the 1899 General Conference session by the GC President George Irwin. He stressed medical missionary work and addressing socio-economic ills and needs, and he declared with evident pride, "This work has spread. Until now, medical and rescue missions have been established and are being successfully carried on in nearly all the prominent cities of the United States. Thousands in this way are being clothed and fed, and souls are being rescued from sin and degradation." City mission was no longer only primarily about personal visitation and Bible studies. It had become almost identified with medical mission. Though one should stress that this was medical mission broadly conceived, what the church presently promotes as comprehensive health ministry. The obvious question to ask at this point is, how did things change so much? This is a question both about the long term. How was it that we, as a church, largely abandoned cities except for comfortable suburbs and had to re-spark urban mission in the last 10 to 15 years? But even more, it is a question about the short term. How did things change so much just in the 10 years between Irwin's words in 1899 and 1909, when the lack of work in cities led Ellen White to issue the stinging rebuke to church leaders with which I began this paper? For all the activity and for all that was being done right and done well, some things were going wrong. One was theological missteps. Crucially, under Kellogg's influence, the distinctively Adventist character of the flagship mission in Chicago had gradually been abandoned. Kellogg increasingly portrayed the mission as a Christian one, not an Adventist one. And he restructured the mission's governance so that the American Medical Missionary College, which he had founded and led, was the mission's parent. But Kellogg had amended the governance of the college and of Battle Creek Sanitarium so that they were no longer Adventist controlled. In 1900, Ellen White raised concerns about the non-denominational nature of the Chicago mission. Over the next few years, Kellogg would be at loggerheads with Mrs. White and with the General Conference officers over his doctrinal views and over control of Battle Creek Sanitarium and of the mission, and relations were very strained. The controversy over Kellogg, which ultimately led to his being disfellowshipped in 1907, discredited to some extent the methods of the Chicago mission, even the concept of city mission itself, as they were tarred with the Kellogg brush, deemed guilty by association. However, in 1909 and 1910, there was a revival in urban mission thanks to the emphatic encouragement of Ellen White. In December 1909, the General Conference Committee voted $18,000 for city missions. No small sum. Adjusted for inflation, it would be around $500,000 today. In addition, to those sums, world evangelistic appropriations in 1909 totaled $214,000. Of that sum, 1/12 went to 6 U.S. cities. 1/12 of the whole world evangelistic appropriations. They went to Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Portland, Maine, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. New York got $12,500, or over 2/3 of the total appropriation for urban mission, and the General Conference President Arthur Daniels himself went to New York City to conduct public evangelism. And yet, by the end of the 1910s, there had been a definite and almost terminal decline in city missions. My staff and I have only been able to identify a handful in the 1920s. So why did all the effort of 1910 and 1911 ultimately end up in disappointment, with the church ending up focusing again on rural areas and small towns? I propose that there were 5 factors. First, an enduring perception that Kellogg's missional methodology was tainted, not just his theology and ecclesiology. Second, the death of Ellen White in 1915, which removed the foremost and most eloquent advocate of city work. Third, the immense distraction and destruction of the World War. Fourth, the influence in the decade following the First World War of fundamentalism, to which Adventists were not immune, and which tended to affirm positions that were socially and politically conservative, not just theologically conservative. But this mattered because of the 5th factor, which I want to stress, and which was the nature of city work. It was difficult, dirty, smelly, insalubrious work. involving ministry to the working classes, to immigrants, to African Americans, to the poor, to prostitutes. All this meant it attracted social stigma. But by this time, Seventh-day Adventists wanted to be respectable. The United States was increasingly no longer predominantly seen as the lamb-like beast that would persecute us. It was the society whose approval we desired. The evidence that the decline in city mission was associated with more than Kellogg is partly statistical. If we go back to 1900, it is notable that the General Conference Bulletin reported city missions in 24 cities in 17 states and 3 countries outside the US. These numbers reflect no significant shift from 1888 in 12 years. So the expansion in city missions of the 1880s had stalled and plateaued before the crisis with Kellogg over control of the American Medical Missionary College and the Chicago Mission. There undoubtedly were other difficulties and challenges. One of these was the expense of working in big cities, a recurrent problem which we still face today. A report to the 1889 GC session acknowledged some excellent results have been seen from working in from city mission work in the past, but it has proved too expensive for the various state conferences to establish and maintain missions in all their large cities. But another problem was the pronounced perception that urban mission primarily meant ministry to ethnic groups. In the mid-1890s, Chicago actually had 2 missions. The first was the main mission led by Kellogg, often called the English mission, that is, English-speaking. But there was also the Scandinavian mission, which focused on people who spoke Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, and eventually it became known simply as the Swedish mission. When a new mission was founded in Winnipeg in 1897, Canadian church leaders asked the General Conference to send a German colporteur and a Norwegian laborer, for these were the ethnic groups that were going to be targeted. The same year, work in Louisville and Chattanooga was begun by an African-American pastor, Louis Sheath, while in 1900 a new mission was established in Atlanta by a white northerner, M.C. Sturdivant, but all 3 missions ministered only to local blacks. 9 years later, after Ellen White's post-GC session testimony, with which I began this paper, the leaders who she rebuked brought proposals to the 1909 Autumn Council. One stressed the need for greater resources in city mission in the large cities of the northeastern United States, but it was on the grounds that there is in Greater New York and other eastern cities a vast foreign population of all nations and tongues who must soon hear the truths of this mission. City work meant black or immigrant work. It was niche work, specialized work, and often seen as not respectable. In 1910, a large part of the Autumn Council was devoted to city mission. George B. Starr, who had been involved with city work for 24 years, read a paper entitled How to Conduct a City Mission, in which he emphasized the combination of evangelistic and medical work. But he also suggested the elimination of the word mission from our city efforts, as that name has come to signify work for the depressed classes. And he didn't mean the mentally unwell, he meant the lower classes. Evidently, they were not who Starr wanted to reach. Hetty Haskell, who had several years' experience in New York City, began her paper by urging that a respectable quarter of the city should be the location for a mission. The views of Starr and Haskell suggest that the focus of city mission was no longer on the majority of a city's inhabitants, those with the greatest needs, and on ministering to their needs. Instead, Adventists sought to reach the prosperous middle classes, even though these were everywhere a minority of city dwellers. The switch in focus was betrayed by Roland D. Quinn, president of the New York Conference, who declared that his preferred outreach method in tents and halls this year has brought 200 new members and raised the tithe $4,000. Evidently, City Mission was now expected to be self-funding, but this impelled City Mission in a certain direction and towards certain kinds of people and certain social classes. The nature of city work had in fact shifted. From personal visitation and Bible study, initially, the focus became one of relieving the suffering of humanities, as Ellen White put it. The poor were clothed and fed, illness was treated, wellness was promoted. The new aim was, in George Irwin's words, to rescue from sin and degradation. Then the focus shifted again to providing spiritual comfort to those who had no real physical wants and who could, in exchange, provide the funds needed to maintain expensive institutions that catered chiefly to the middle class and suburbanites. And in some ways, perhaps this trajectory is understandable. As far as we can tell, most Seventh-day Adventists in early 20th century North America were Anglo-Saxon or Northern European in ethnicity. To go back to the Swedish mission in Chicago, I don't doubt that hard-working middle-class people of Swedish descent were easier to deal with than the denizens of the teeming city streets where once the lifeboat mission had been a veritable lighthouse in the dark. With hindsight, we can see that Seventh-day Adventists had abandoned the city to the Prince of Darkness. And Chicago was not the only city of which this was true. Adventists did not want to deal with the dirty, dusty, gritty, smoky, unhealthy downtown neighborhoods or their equally soiled, filthy, foreign, illiterate, intoxicated inhabitants, many of them Italians, Poles, Jews, and blacks. Sometimes the most seductive temptation is respectability. And that is as true in the early 21st century as the early 20th century. Succumbing to the desire for respectability helped to end the first golden age of Adventist City Mission. And so the seductiveness of respectability, it seems to me, is one of the chief lessons to be learned from the early history of Adventist City Missions.
So it is time for the discussion now. As you're bringing up your questions, we're going to roll a quick video. But bring up your questions during the video.
More than 150 years ago, Andrews University was founded in faith. And today, we move forward in mission. When the Seventh-day Adventist Church was established in 1863, it was committed to giving a life-changing message to the world. As leaders moved forward in faith, they founded their first institution of higher education, Battle Creek College, in 1874, to educate future generations to carry forward the mission of sharing hope and healing in the world. The stated purpose of the new school was an institution where students would not only reach the highest attainments in science, but through a knowledge of God may be educated to glorify Him. After more than 25 years in Battle Creek, in 1901, the college moved by train to the Berrien Springs community in beautiful Southwest Michigan, where it was renamed Emmanuel Missionary College. One of the goals was to offer more opportunities for a whole-person education, including practical experience along with classroom learning. When the seminary and graduate school based in Maryland joined the Berrien campus in 1960, EMC became Andrews University, named in honor of pioneer church scholar and missionary John Nevins Andrews. Andrews and his family had departed for service in Europe in 1874. and his dedication to academic excellence and God's mission continues to inspire the university today. From the original 110 students enrolled at Battle Creek College, Andrews University has grown into a global university, educating students from more than 100 countries, both on the Michigan campus and around the world. Today, we continue to move forward in our mission to transform students by educating them to seek knowledge and affirm faith in order to change the world. At Andrews University, we seek knowledge by pushing the boundaries of research and innovation, preparing our graduates in each field to lead with outstanding excellence. Our students learn to be careful thinkers and creative problem solvers, engaging in interactive classes that extend beyond the classroom through fieldwork, study tours, and internships. Our faculty involves students in cutting-edge scholarship that helps us better understand the universe, drives exciting discoveries, and makes a real difference in people's lives. At Andrews University, we have firm faith through committed biblical scholarship and by providing vibrant worship and service opportunities, giving our students avenues to express and deepen their faith. Each of our dedicated faculty and staff are passionate about teaching students to think biblically and love God with all their hearts and minds. With this foundation, our graduates go forth from Andrews University ready to extend God's mission through their personal and professional lives as the next generation of leaders to serve in the church and throughout the world. Finally, our students and alumni are changing the world by addressing urgent needs both globally and locally. Students engage in service and research projects where they tackle current challenges, whether through innovative building projects and engineering solutions, providing essential medical and other mental health services, through the ministry of teaching and preaching, and in many other ways. Service and mission experiences around the world provide our students with practical opportunities to share with those in need and inspire them to continue making a difference for God in the world. This is Andrews University. World changers made here.
For more than 150 years, Andrews University has been more than just a school. It's been a place where faith and mission intersect in deep and meaningful ways to change the world.
We invite you to join us. Be a part of this amazing journey.
Come visit or apply online today. We can't wait to welcome you into our Andrews family.
I invite the panelists to come up, and I've got some questions to begin the discussion. I also want the panelists to feel free to ask questions of each other or to have follow-up. Thank you for those of you who have put in questions. We have some good ones here. There's more coming up. I'll grab them as we go. First one is for Trevor. You all have microphones? Good. So Trevor, the health reform was part of the mission to reach people, or was it solely for better health? Today, ADRA works to provide health and to provide assistance irregardless of whether Adventist beliefs are held by the people they're helping. And I have a hard time with some of the words here. Was this the time at the beginning of the health reform? Was mission or better health the main reason?
I think that it probably was I didn't know why I said to prepare the people for translation, actually. These are her words. But I think they begin to realize that health could be used, later on she talks about, as an opening wedge, a way of reaching people, especially the highly educated people who may not be as receptive to biblical, spiritual things, but are more inclined are willing to at least listen to ideas about how they could improve their health right here.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Okay. So this one is not addressed to a specific person, but it was touched on in two of the presentations at least. While the figure of Bible workers was historically advanced in the church's missions to many unreached territories, why today does there not exist a notorious support program for such incredible program within our church as in the past? This has to do with how are we training Bible workers and using Bible workers as we did in the past?
I think that's a good question. Why there isn't a program, I don't know. It is the case that we historically had training programs for Bible workers as well as for pastors. And if you look at the early days of Adventist education in various places, Bible workers had their own training. Perhaps the tendency now is to subsume, at least in certain parts of the world, is to subsume Bible workers under commissioned ministers and therefore just have them go through the same training program as all pastors. But in other parts of the world, that isn't the case. But I'm showing my ignorance here. They may well actually have Bible worker training programs at their colleges. I think certainly if they don't, then that example that we had in the past of particular training for Bible workers as well as for those who are on a pastoral track is a good one.
So am I hearing that there's more different tracks in some of our international institutions than there are in our...
No, I'm saying I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else know that one? Okay, here we go. Ellen G. White clearly, from Dr. Trim's presentation, pushed missions to the cities. However, I'm also aware that she suggests avoiding the cities and especially not raising children there. How do these early missionaries, pastors to the cities safeguard against personal degradation and the degradation of their children morally while still being faithful, relational ministers?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I would say I have published a co-authored article in the Journal of the Adventist Theological Society a couple of years ago, partly on this point, and to which I would refer the questioner. But I mean, it's partly what Ellen White says is we shouldn't have institutions in the cities because they are sites of degradation, and also because cities back then genuinely were terrible places to live environmentally and in terms of health. Cities today would still in many cases be polluted, but they were far worse in the late 19th century. They truly were places that were bad for one's physical health as well as one's moral health. So she says we shouldn't have institutions there, and she encourages many people to live outside cities, but she also encourages others to live inside cities to do mission. And indeed, I mentioned Hetty Haskell. How did she and her husband, Stephen Haskell, the famous church leader, acquire their experience of mission in New York? By living in the middle of New York City. So Ellen White always had the idea that there would be people who would live in the cities and do mission there. Her idea is that the questioner asks, how can they avoid that degradation, the moral degradation of the influence, is partly by having what she calls outpost centers, which typically were based at nearby Adventist sanitaria. So we would have a sanitarium, what would now be a hospital, based relatively close to a city, from which people could go and have periods of rest and refreshment, moral as well as physical.
Okay, yeah, please.
Can I push back a little bit on David's presentation related to what we were just discussing? History is always complex, never simple. And I wonder whether Ellen White and church leaders could be seen on both sides of the scene here. For example, Andrews started his mission in Europe in a city. It was a city mission. They ran evangelistic. This was the city of Basel. And James White criticized him heavily for that because he said we should follow the mission pattern in America and start mission in villages. But Andrews given the local situation, felt that city work was more important. And there were certain conditions that dictated that. So that's one sort of area that I think makes the whole picture a little more complex. The other thing is that in city evangelism, in the 1890s at least, in Melbourne I'm thinking particularly, Ellen White advised them to run their campaigns and to live where they were conducting the evangelistic activity in the wealthier suburbs so that they could attract more educated people. And that was with her encouragement. And so they were able to attract to the mission in Melbourne, for example, people who were wealthy, people who had a background. And that was a good way to get the church started and anchored. Harry Leonard said on one occasion that our failure in Britain as a mission was that we were not able to relate to the working class. And that supports your argument. So I just suggested it's more complex.
Yeah, I would push back at that, Gil, right back at you, my dear friend, because I think actually Ellen White is incredibly consistent. And Ellen White herself is constantly teaching against extremes, which is why people can... I once heard one of our church leaders say that you can play Ellen White ping pong, trading Ellen White quotations backwards and forwards. And the reason is because she herself is generally very in the mainstream of Adventist thought and rejects extremes. And so you can find quotations which look as though she's belonging to another extreme herself, whereas she's simply trying to attack the other extreme and pull people back to the middle. But on city missions, she's incredibly consistent. And it's 1874 when she has that first vision in which the angel says, the cities are part of the vineyard and must be worked. And the fact that she has that vision is telling us that there were indeed people like James White who's saying, no, we just keep working in the small towns. But Ellen White is very consistent over the years in encouraging. And I don't think it's the case that she would have disapproved of working sometimes in suburbs, precisely for the reasons, as you say, in Melbourne, of trying to attract wealthier people who can support the mission. But she's also very clear that you need to be working in, as well as in the suburbs and attracting the wealthier people, amongst the poor. And that's driven home again and again in some of the quotations I already used, and also in things I didn't quote about her support for what was happening in San Francisco.
So let me push a little farther on that. The idea that Ellen White was expanding the view of God's law to include the prophetic voice for justice and care for the poor and the underserved. How does that relate to the idea of missions both to the suburbs and to the inner portion? You have the effect of God's law behind it.
Yeah, I think it's clear where she talks about there that, where she, especially because she quotes Isaiah, and then talks about the need to be working to relieve the sufferings of humanity. It's very clear. You don't find the sufferings of humanity so much in a comfortable middle class. Not that there were suburbs in the same way back then, but they were starting to appear. You relieve the sufferings of humanity where people are actually suffering.
Yeah. So let me push Gil a little bit on the imminence problem. So you talked about several different ways in which they explained the time. And here we are, 150 years from then. How are we currently explaining the time?
That's a good question. That requires a long period of thought. I think within the church there are several ways that we explain to ourselves the time delay. And one is the harvest principle, that God is waiting for a generation to demonstrate faithful living to his law. The other is that the gospel has not yet been preached in all the world. And those two, I think, are the probably current dominant ways that we explain the delay, and both live together in uncomfortable harmony, but harmony nevertheless.
And actually, as early as certainly by 1905, A.G. Daniel starts pressing home a message which tells people this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then, but not until then, that's his words, will the end come for which we so earnestly long. So in that second generation of Adventist leaders who still believe in the imminence of the second coming and have an apocalyptic urgency for proclamation, partly because not until it's proclaimed to all the nations will the end come. And that's not just an implicit but an explicit message that's being given, as I say, as early as the early 1900s.
So, Trevor, you pushed the quadrilateral as effective in Jamaica. Was that a timed thing? If Jamaica was being entered in this century as a fresh frontier, would the same quadrilateral work? In other words, I'm asking, does the quadrilateral still apply to the new places we have frontier missionaries going to today?
Well, since I haven't lived in Jamaica for the last 47 years, I can't quite answer that question. I suppose that as the time changes, the mission strategy has to change to adapt to changing circumstances. So the missiological quadrilateral that was successful in Jamaica may not necessarily be successful in this day and age or in a particular country. I think that we have to understand the particular circumstance of an individual place and provide a model that is effective and relevant for that particular place.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? Okay, we'll leave it. You also, Trevor, talked about the Sabbath as an entry point and health as an entry point. And I'm wondering if those two can still be entry points.
I think so. And you know, what I said about the health message in Jamaica, I think this was one of the areas where the church did not invest enough resources to actually reach people, especially the middle class and the upper class. And I think this is one of the actual failings of that missiological quadrilateral in Jamaica. But I think that the Sabbath, importance of the Sabbath and the message are still things that are very relevant for people. We live in a world where people are hustling and bustling, and the Sabbath provides them an oasis in time, away from the rush and the busyness of life. Everyone needs that. And also, people are always concerned about their health, you know, and it doesn't matter where you live. It's important to be living well. Vitality and longevity are still things that people are concerned about, regardless of their culture.
Yeah, and I think health is very much still an opening. Some of you may have seen reports how just a couple of weeks ago at the General Conference we were visited by the King and Queen of Tonga, who came because they were interested, they'd had a meeting with Elder Wilson earlier this year when he was in the South Pacific, but they were interested in Adventist health because Tonga has a public health crisis. And they want their people to live more healthfully, to live fuller, richer lives. And they were aware from talk of the blue zones that Adventists could offer something on that. And so immediately there's an opportunity to make contact at a very high level with a government, but also then to work in a society in a way that wouldn't exist without that Adventist health message.
John, can I give a personal testimony?
Please.
I know a pastor in California who is 104 years old. He raised up around 16 churches. His name is Pastor William Curlew. And every time he gives his ID to the cashier wherever he goes, they're shocked. Because at 104, he's full of vitality, his back is straight, and he uses that as an opportunity to share the message of Adventism. I mean, it's amazing how he's given all of these opportunities, because people are always amazed at this man who is 104 years old. So in fact, he becomes a living witness of Adventist living, of what it means to be a good Adventist and living healthy. So it's still very much relevant in our day and age.
And I will add a quasi-personal testimony, which is my father in the early 1970s was called to Sydney Adventist Hospital to open a center for health education. They did vegetarian cooking, they did stress management, they did cardiac monitoring, they did blood pressure, and they not only improved the health of people in that area, people came into the church because people had an avenue to come into the church now that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And my father baptized people, other people baptized people, and then eventually, it's a long story, but that very large and successful Adventist hospital became solely focused on acute care and not on wellness. And they closed down their health education center. And now, just in the last few years, the South Pacific Division has reopened. They don't call it, it has a different name, but they've reopened a community health outreach center, and it's beginning to have an effect again.
Good, good. Okay, I'm going to go to a bit of a subtle question now. The earliest Gentile Christianity was largely urban, and they eventually, gradually evangelized the countryside. The countryside in the Roman Empire was often distrusted as bumpkins. The idea of pagan comes from originally rural people, the heathen, connected to rurality, etc., etc. And Adventism has largely been a rural religion, by contrast to early Christianity, and that we have had to articulate how we are going to eventually get to the cities and have to keep coming back to getting to the cities. So the sophisticated, unsophisticated circumstances between cities and outlying communities in the Roman Empire under early Christianity is kind of the opposite of what we're finding in Adventism today. So the subtlety of the question is then, what are the implications for Adventism today?
John, I just want to make one slight correction on that assumption, and that is blacks, African-American blacks are mainly in the cities. And in fact, when people talk about no mission in the city, they forget that the vast majority of African Americans in the Adventist church are living in the cities. Their churches are in the cities. It so happened that there are not many white churches in the cities, but the work among African Americans is primarily an urban work. Yeah. And this was from the very beginning, and it still continues to be in that way.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at in the General Conference archives, we have minutes of the Inner City Committee from the late 60s and early 70s. And if you look at the records of the Inner City Committee, what it is mission to African Americans. Almost without exception, its code for black ministry is calling it Inner City, because there were so few whites at that stage. But what we've seen over the last 50 years is people coming back into the cities with gentrification and so forth, things we're all familiar with. And whereas once, and at the same time, you've had African Americans becoming more prosperous and moving out to suburbs. So we can no longer assume that inner city work means only one type of ethnicity. Yeah. As to it is true that our history was at odds with the early church, but of course there were 1900 years that separated them and all kinds of dramatic social upheavals and events. So I'm not too concerned about that, except to say that it did take us time to realize we needed to have a witness in cities as well as the rural areas, but that was something that Ellen White was always pushing us towards. And Ellen White's last statement on this is to say, if I had health, I would be in the cities now. She's writing this when she's 85. If I had the health, I would be in the city. So I think that's as decisive as you can want.
Yeah.
And John, I see some continuity between New Testament evangelism with Paul and John Andrews' evangelism in Europe and Conradi and others, in that the success of early Christian evangelism was kinship-based. There were a lot of friends and relatives. I mean, that's in Jesus' family, Paul's own family, the list of names in Romans 16. A lot of kinship there, and the gospel spread quickly amongst those of similar kin. That was true in Europe as well. Yeah. John Andrews worked with kinship groups in Switzerland and in Germany. And those kinship groups helped the gospel to spread, Adventism to spread very quickly. Conradi picked that up later, and it became a very successful way. And I suggest that speaks to us today too, because in our world, immigrant communities come from elsewhere, settle in cities, and kinship evangelism amongst the immigrant groups is still a marked way for success today, I think.
Yeah. So I want to return one more time to the imminence thing. So we've shifted from a focus on getting at least one person into the Adventist church from every nation, tongue, and kindred to now trying to reach every person in the nation, tongue, and kindred. So our work is not done until everybody has heard, whereas the work was defined as done as soon as somebody from each had heard in previous generations. So for the imminence thing now, we still believe that the second coming is imminent, and the more our world changes, the more we see the need for the second coming, etc. And of course, speed of being able to get to every person is reaching at the speed of light cables and the internet. How do you see the tension now and in the immediate future of Adventist missions between imminence and getting the job done?
I think we learned along the way to shift from imminence to urgency, and the fact that people are going to Christless graves. And we are much more aware of the vast numbers in those categories. I mean, the 1040 window and huge secular groups that we are becoming more sensitive to. And the knowledge that they are perishing without Christ provides the urgency that is impelling, and the love of Christ constrains us to proclaim the gospel to them. And the Lord will care for the coming when he's ready.
Yeah, so we have 2 Peter 3. Yeah. So the 2 Peter 3, that what Jesus is waiting for is for everybody to be saved. Last question here, and it's a future-oriented question. So what's the future for city missions? And how is the world church moving forward on that matter? And of course, we had a little hint of that from Erethan Kohler's welcome, but maybe a comment from each of you.
Well, I think, people need to come back tomorrow and hear Gary Krause speaking on this precise topic. And I would hate to
Good advertising.
I would hate to steal my colleague's thunder as he talks about that, but I think the future is bright.
I think sometimes when we're talking about these kinds of subjects, we forget the world outside. Talk about urban missions. The vast majority of Adventism is in cities in many of these other countries. As far as the distinction between rural and city, such distinctions don't really, it's not their concern. In fact, I think what we need to do here in North America, perhaps go to some of these countries, in Brazil, in places where they have large numbers of churches, and maybe ask these people, how do they do city mission? Because they've been doing it all their lives. And I think that this is where the church in North America is not always open to learning from the experience and the knowledge that has been forged in many of these places of the world, especially regarding urban mission.
Gil, last word?
If I reflect on my time in Thailand and in Pakistan, mission is more than just preaching. It's working with people who are illiterate, people who are impoverished, people who live as feudal people, and our Sabbath message, our health message, needs to be integrated in a way that's holistic mission. And I think there is a huge challenge for us in rural areas as well as urban areas in some of those underdeveloped countries.
Well, we've had a good start. We've got a lot more coming. You've got your programs. What time are we starting in the morning? 8:30. Okay, very good. I'm going to have a prayer, and I'm going to dismiss you, and I will see you tomorrow at 8:30. Let's bow our heads. Our loving God, I want to thank you that you have called this church to mission. As we focus on the past and look forward to the future of Seventh-day Adventist mission, I pray that you would bring us there together. Thank you, Lord, for the blessings so far of this weekend. Continue to bless, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless. See you tomorrow. There are drinks and refreshments in the commons. Please partake.